All right, in this lecture, we're going to talk about two types of lighting effects that are really important to help take your painting to the next level and make it a little bit more realistic. So these two things are ambient occlusion and reflected light. Okay, so the first one, ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is, you can see it all around you, right? If you look at your hand and you see all the little wrinkles in your hands, and all those little wrinkles are a little bit darker than everything else. It's not because someone drew a line on your hand or anything like that. It's because of that little crack. When the light rays come down and they bounce around on your skin, it's harder for those light rays to reach inside those little cracks, and so they tend to be a little bit darker. If you look in the corner of a room, typically the corners will be a little bit darker, and it's not because someone drew a line in the corner of the room, it's because ambient occlusion, right? When those light rays come, they bounce off the edges of the wall, and as they bounce around, it gets increasingly more and more difficult for light to get into the little tiny cracks, right? So, I mean, it's everywhere. You can see it. You can see it all around you when someone's standing on the ground. For example, if you look at the ground where someone's standing, there'll be a little dark line around their shoe and the cement or wherever it is they're standing, and that's because light can't quite reach into those little spaces. So what we're going to do, we're going to paint that first. We're going to make a new layer, set it to multiply here, and you can use the same file, I'll provide it. And we're going to go in and try and find the places where we need to put some ambient occlusion to help this look a little bit more realistic. Now, because it's going to be so fine and so small, I am using a pencil tool, okay, to paint this in. And anywhere where the cracks get really tight is where I want to paint this, right? You don't want to go overboard, okay? But you do want to find out where it needs to be. So right now, I'm down here in his foot, his back leg, okay? And I'm really just pushing it in those deepest shadow spots. We're on his other foot now, right where your fingers come together. A lot of times you got ambient occlusion. Okay. Let's look up here on the saddle, right? There's lots of little places, right, where her leg meets that saddle. It's going to get really, really dark right in there. Okay. Same with her foot in the stirrup and all these leather pieces, right? Wherever that is meeting another object and they're sitting right up next against each other, like the saddle and this blanket here, it's going to get real dark. Okay? Little things like that are really going to help add some detail, a little bit more depth. Okay? Same in here on her shirt. Okay? Maybe a few spots in her hair that need to be a little darker. Okay? Excellent. Let's see, probably underneath, where these straps lay against the dinosaur's skin, right? Those are all places that will get some ambient occlusion. Inside the mouth here, there's lots of crevices going on in here where it may be difficult for light to fully reach. Okay, all places that can use ambient occlusion. Okay, now it can be time consuming and it takes a while to go through and do this, but it's worth it when you're painting a picture if you're trying to make it look realistic, because that's kind of how you define the outline of things a lot of times with ambient occlusion. Right now we can still see that we have the line work going, but if we were to turn that line work all the way off, we wouldn't really know a lot of these forms as well without going in and doing ambient occlusion everywhere, okay? For now we're going to leave the line work on since I'm not going through and adding it everywhere. That is something you'd want to do. Okay, so now we're going to make a new layer on top of everything else, and we're going to talk about reflected light. Okay, now typically you just have your main light source. It's coming down, it's hitting your object, it's casting shadows, making highlights, right? But not all that light is getting absorbed by the object, right? There's lots of light that's coming down here, and it's coming down, and then it's bouncing back off and hitting other things, right? Now, when light bounces off something, it diminishes and loses a lot of its power, about 80 to 90% of it. But some of it still keeps going. So even this light down here, it's coming down, it's hitting the floor near the dinosaur, it's going to bounce back up and light the underside of his tail, okay, and the rest of his body. So we're going to have this be a really light, faint blue, right, because your reflected light is going to be just a diminished version of whatever the color of your light is, or whatever it's reflecting off of. So for example, if the ground was red, then when the white light hit the red ground, it would bounce off with sort of a pinkish color and light the underside of this. But since it's white, we're just going to go with this really light blue sort of color. We're going to come in here and just sketch in a little bit of this reflected light coming in along the bottom of the dinosaur. Now you can see already it's going to really start to add another layer of dimensionality to this and believability just from that reflected light coming in. Okay, and you're going to treat it just like any other light source, right? Except for it's not quite as strong, right? It's pretty soft. Okay, and if you need to, after you go in here, you can always bring it back a little bit with the opacity tool and lower the opacity. Okay, but we're just coming in here and lighten some of these spaces up just a little bit. All right. Under here, his arm, okay. You can just go throughout the whole thing and do this. Also, the bottom of his leg here, that's facing the ground, that's going to be getting lit up, okay. Bottom of his thigh. And you can see it already makes a pretty big difference. Front of his shin here, that's facing towards the ground. Especially with something really bright like this, is going to be quite a bit of reflected light. Okay. And you just go along and do this to the whole image. You don't want to overdo it, right? You want to think. It really takes some critical thinking to think about where the light's coming from, how strong it's going to be, what parts it would reach, what parts it wouldn't reach, what color it's going to be, right? If you're outside and you have a really strongly lit sunlight scene and they're standing in grass, then the reflected light coming up from the grass is probably going to be slightly green, right? It just depends. You're going to have to really think about it. Okay? So she might get a little bit on the bottom of her boots or anything like that. Maybe just a bit on the bottom of her arm. Okay? So you can see it makes a big difference. Let's get this to the right size here. And then when we can turn that on and off, it adds a lot more dimensionality. It doesn't look quite so flat. And if you need to lower the opacity so it's not quite so prominent, that's totally fine. Or if you want to set it to one of our lighten layers like screen or add or anything like that, you can do that too. Okay? So there you go. That's ambient occlusion and reflected light. Your assignment, you're going to take this image without the occlusion or reflected light, and you're going to go through and add any places that need occlusion and add any places that need reflected light. So that's it for this lecture. I'll see you guys in the next one.